Hey, everybody. So today we're going to cover the Civil War, a very brief version of the Civil War. You can get a lot more information. I think like the Great Courses offers a 48 lecture series on the Civil War, which ends up being 24 hours of lecturing, which is really good, by the way. But our goal here is to keep it brief and keep it simple, especially for testing purposes, and we're running out of time during the semester. So let's talk about the Civil War. Well, Lincoln had won the presidency, and for the South, this was a disaster. They felt like they no longer can control the South. They had fairly much controlled the presidency until the Compromise of 1850, and then that was lost, and we lost that balance of free states to slave states. But what we don't know is that back in those days, you had to wait until March 4th to get sworn in, not January 20th like we do now. That didn't come along until the 20th Amendment. So Lincoln has to wait till March 4th to do anything. So on December 20th, South Carolina says we're leaving the Union. South Carolina had always been somewhat of a troublemaker, obviously, during the nullification crisis. And if you look at the South Carolinian Declaration, they say that slavery is the number one issue. In fact, they send out ambassadors to other southern states saying we've got to protect our slaves. In fact, when you look at the documentation before the war, for the South, it's all about slavery. That's all they're talking about is slavery. After the war, when they know that they're sort of on the wrong side of history, they sort of change their tune and they start saying, well, no, it wasn't about slavery. It was about constitutional issues. But at the time, it was. I mean, Alexander Stephens gave this cornerstone speech where he said that this whole war was going to be about slavery, and that white people were superior to the slave. So don't ever buy into this thing where it says, well, it wasn't about slavery. It certainly was for the South. So South Carolina leaves on December 20th, and in early February, the other deep South states leave as well. So what does Buchanan, who's still the president until March 4th, do? Well, Buchanan says that secession is illegal, but he has no power to force a state back into the Union. So in other words, he's going to fiddle while Rome burns in that regard. And that's why Buchanan is often listed as one of the worst presidents in the United States history. Well, Lincoln enters office declaring that he has nothing against slavery. He goes, I'm not going to attack slavery where it is. I don't have the power to do that. I just don't want to expand slavery into the territories. But he says that he will fight to preserve the Union at all costs. So he's got some problems. He's the first Republican in office, so he doesn't have an established bureaucracy of Republicans running the government. Now, he's got a pretty good cabinet made up of good, powerful men. Secretary of State was William Seward. Treasury was Salmon Chase. War was Edward Stanton. Navy, Gideon Welles. And a lot of these people were former rivals of Lincoln. In fact, there's a great book by Doris Kearns Goodwin called A Team of Rivals that you should read. Well, in February, before Lincoln had taken office, they had formed the Confederate States of America. They had made their original capital in Montgomery, Alabama. They'll later move that to Richmond when Virginia decides to leave. So Lincoln, excuse me, says that, look, we won't attack the South unless they attack us, but we are going to hold on to federal forts. Well, they have a federal fort called Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina, and it's running out of supplies. So Lincoln decides that he's going to resupply it. He tells the South there won't be any military gear there, just food. And they open fire on the ship. The ship, which was the Star of the West, which was named, oddly enough, after Henry Clay, the Great Compromiser. Then the Confederates on April 12th opened fire on Fort Sumter. 2 days later, Sumter surrenders because they're out of ammo and they can't fight anymore. And so they only suffered one death, and that was by an accident. Well, Lincoln then calls upon the loyal states to raise troops to suppress the rebellion, 75,000 loyal troops. Well, this causes what we call a second secession. Virginia decides to leave. They didn't like the South leaving, but they didn't want to see force against the South. And so when they see the federal government using force, they decide to leave as well. So Virginia leaves on April 17th, May 6th, Arkansas, May 7th, Tennessee, May 20th, North Carolina. Kentucky stays. Now, the Confederates often try to claim Kentucky as somebody to leave, but they did not. Missouri was racked by bitter fighting. It's going to be won by the North, but there's going to be guerrilla warfare for the next decade. And with Virginia, we get a new state, West Virginia. West Virginia decides that it doesn't want to be part of Virginia anymore, and so they split off and become their own state in 1863. Now, Maryland was a tricky thing. Maryland was full of secessionists, people that wanted to leave the Union. Maryland had considered itself a Southern state. And so Lincoln was concerned that if Virginia and Maryland had both left the Union, that leaves Washington, D.C. essentially in enemy territory. So Lincoln goes and violates the Constitution. He suspends the writ of habeas corpus until Union leaders are elected to office. He takes these people who are opposed and puts them in jail without charging them. So Lincoln decides that it's time to go to war. So let's take a look at both sides and what their advantages are. Now, often when you hear about the South, some of the old lost cause mythology said that the South had no chance to win. That's not true. That's not true at all. In fact, there's going to be several times in this whole battle that the South almost wins. And to say they had no chance to win, well, they certainly believe they did. So when we look at the comparison of the two, the Union had 23 states, 22 million people, 97% of the firearms, 96% of the railroads, almost all the major shipping and banking interests. And the North was able to increase wheat production in the war and sell it to Europe. Their railroads were 20,000 miles of railroads and well organized. They had the same railroad grade. Now, for the Confederation, they only had 11 states, 9 million people, 3.5 million which were slaves, only 7.4% of manufactured goods. They used King Cotton diplomacy, trying to sell cotton to fund the war. That doesn't work out too well because Europe has a surplus of cotton. And then, of course, railroads, they have about 10,000 miles, but they use different gauges of track, so that's not well organized either. But when it comes to the battles, you're going to see that both sides are about equally organized in terms of weapons and supplies, and even generals. All these generals had gone to West Point. They had all read the same books. So Lincoln is going to need an army, so he relies on states to recruit men. And they would allow commanders to recruit their own units. Now, this meant you're going to have some pretty bad leaders in their units, but they still create units. In the South, they established the first draft in American history in April 16 of 1862. And this leads some harsh resentment to Southern leaders who that a lot of people said this was a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. And it's interesting when you look at the South and their new constitution, it was a much more controlling constitution, a much more powerful central government than you'd ever seen in the North. They're the first to establish a draft. They're the first to establish an income tax. They even said that once you joined the Confederacy, you couldn't leave. So it's really what they didn't like in the North, they're creating in the South. So like I said, most of the military leaders had trained at West Point. They had studied Napoleon. They knew that that you didn't want to have frontal assaults. Everybody knew that the best way to do it was to seek battles of maneuver, trying to move around people's flanks and come up with a brilliant stroke. Now, the Union plan is come up with by Winfield Scott. He says, look, this is what we're going to call the Anaconda Plan. We'll establish a blockade around the South. It's going to be difficult because it's a lot of coastline. Then we'll send an army down through the Mississippi, split the Confederacy in half, and then we'll send armies down the major Tennessee rivers, splitting them in half, and force the South into surrender. Uh, and so that's actually the plan in the long run that actually wins the war. So the North has this North has an established leadership. They have established control of their military. The South's problem is that they have 11 different states fighting wars, and not everybody comes through like they say they will. North Carolina and Georgia hold out supplies. Texas sends the fewest troops outside the borders. Other governors didn't like sending troops either. And so the South's plan, we'll come back to the South's plan. Well, the first battle of the war is going to be the first battle of Bull Run. Now, a run is a creek, and it depends on who wins the battles on how they name them. The Southerners named them after towns, and the Northerners named them after geographical features. So at the first Battle of Bull Run, it's named after a creek. It's sometimes called the First Battle of Manassas by the Southerners because it's near the town of Manassas. But it was July 21st, 1861. The Union general was General Irwin McDowell versus the Confederate general, General Beauregard. Now, many Northerners think this battle will be a rout. They think the Southerners can't fight, they're terrible. And so they actually bring a crowd of onlookers, and these onlookers bring picnics. Now, I don't get that. Why would you go to a picnic to watch people get shot? But they did. But it turns out not to be a rout. The South attacks Union troops. The troops panic. They start running over all the picnic baskets, and they flee all the way back to Washington, D.C. And there was this fear in Washington that night that the Confederates would invade Washington, D.C., but they don't give chase. The interesting thing about Bull Run, it does give General Jackson his name of General Stonewall Jackson. Now, we don't know if that was a compliment or not. The guy was saying Jackson is sitting there like a stone wall, like, why won't he attack? Or Jackson was sitting there like a stone wall, he's so brave. So Bull Run showed was that the war was not going to be won quickly. This wasn't going to be a fast war. So the Union, you say, look, we've got to have an army protecting Washington always. We've got to blockade the South, and then we're going to divide the Confederacy, invade Mississippi, Tennessee, through the rivers and Cumberland rivers. And so that's splitting the South. That's that Anaconda plan. The Confederate strategy is stalemate, hope for British or French aid, much like the Americans did in the American Revolution. They hoped that eventually they could get the British or the French to declare war on America, and they get close a couple times getting the British to declare war on America, and that would have changed the outcome of the war. And two, they hope public opinion in the North will force the Union out of the war, that if they can drag the war on long enough, that eventually the public will get tired of the North and say, just let them go. And that was a possibility in 1864. So let's talk about some of the major battles that comes along. The first one is the Battle of Shiloh. Now, Grant, U.S. Grant, who we'll talk more about later, will be moving through Tennessee by the way of the Tennessee River. He rests his troops outside of Corinth, Mississippi. Now, this is not a good defensive position because he has his back to the river. In other words, if you have to retreat, there's nowhere to retreat. Well, the Confederates launch a surprise attack, and they kill many Union troops while they sleep, which is a terrible way to wake up, right? Wake up and you're dead. The fighting goes on all day as Grant's forces are pinned against the river, and they may lose. But right about the time necessary, Grant's aide, Ohio General William Tecumseh Sherman, brings fresh troops to the battle and counterattacks. The Union reinforcements arrive, and the Confederates must withdraw. That's a real short version of the Battle of Shiloh. You can actually read the whole entire books about it. It's an interesting story of how people would have to have breaks in the war, and there was a pond of water where both sides felt like they could go and drink without shooting at each other. It's interesting. But the outcome of the battle was that it ended Confederate power in the Mississippi Valley. That was, the Confederates are finished in that area. And then the second thing is that Lincoln and his staff realized this is going to be a long war. And this is a valuable lesson when you take the second half of history. In World War I, they all thought the war was going to be short. They really didn't study the brutality of the American Civil War, and they were in for a shock. Number three out of this battle was that there were 20,000 deaths, which were more deaths than the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, and the Revolutionary War combined. They had never seen death in such a large number. They didn't know how to deal with it. I mean, so many bodies. How do you identify them? There was no such thing as dog tags. How do you bury them? It was a difficult thing. For a lot of people, when they went into battle, they would put a little, note in their shirt saying, if you found this, please mail it and tell my family that I'm dead. Often bodies were left out for months out there. They were buried in shallow graves. The rain would bring them up. People would come and steal gold teeth out of them. It was a mess. And there is a book about that it was written by the president of Harvard, This Republic's Suffering, about how they dealt with such massive death. Now, some people wanted U.S. Grant fired after this battle. They were saying that he was drinking on the job, and Grant was known as a drinker. But Lincoln likes Grant. He says, this man fights, and he likes that. That's opposed to this other man that was running the Eastern campaign, and that was George McClellan. McClellan's going to run what they call the Peninsular Campaign along the Chesapeake area. The Eastern Theater had been quiet since Bull Run. That was 9 months earlier. Lincoln had replaced the Bull Run General McDowell with George McClellan. McClellan looks like a good leader. The troops like him. He likes a well-trained army. He's sometimes called a young Napoleon. But he has some flaws. And his flaws are that he's overly cautious. And he has a big ego. He thinks that he's better than the president. You can read his letters. He calls the president the original guerrilla, that he's a moron. McClellan says he's the only person that can save America. In fact, there's one time that Lincoln goes to visit McClellan. They tell him that McClellan's taking a nap, and Lincoln has to sit down there and wait for 2 hours for him to wake up. McClellan was sort of a fairly big ego. So McClellan's marching his army, he's training his army, and finally Lincoln gets a little bit upset about that. He goes, look, McClellan, go down there and attack Richmond. Get the Confederate capital. I mean, I like the fact that the army marches very nice, but we got to use it. McClellan brags that he'll be in Richmond in 10 days. Well, in March of 1862, he meets Confederate troops at the Battle of Seven Pines, sometimes known as the Battle of Fair Oaks. This battle was going to be another disaster for the Union, but reinforcements arrived just in time to prevent another defeat. What's interesting about this battle is that the Confederate general, Joseph Johnston, is severely wounded. And now there's a new general in charge, Robert E. Lee, and he's a superb field commander. In fact, Lincoln had gone to Lee and asked him to lead the Northern forces, but Lee said he could not turn against his state. And Lee is a slaveholder. So that brings us to the second battle of Bull Run. Now, McClellan is ordered back to Washington to protect the capital. So Lincoln puts another general in charge, John Pope, and orders him to attack Richmond. Pope and his troops fight the Confederates at the Second Battle of Bull Run, but Pope is overly matched. He's confused about what's going on. He doesn't know where the enemy is. In fact, the Confederate cavalry, led by Jeb Stuart, sneak behind Union line, go into Pope's personal tent, and steal his dress uniform. Now, that's embarrassing, right? So Pope exhausts his men looking for the Confederates, and they're exhausted, and then Lee shows up with more troops and attacks Pope's forces as they're tired, and the Union army is forced to retreat. Pope is disgraced, probably without his dress uniform, and sent to Minnesota to fight Indians. So Lincoln says, okay, I'm going to turn back to McClellan. And McClellan, he writes letters to his wife saying they finally learned their lesson. The original guerrilla knows that I'm the only one who can save America. Well, that's going to lead us to the Battle of Antietam. Lee wants to stay on the offensive. He wants to move the fight to Union soil, quit fighting in the South. If he could get the fight into the North, this might show Britain and France that they could win the war and bring foreign aid. And it may also have an impact on Northern public opinion. So Lee leads his troop into Western Pennsylvania. and into Western Maryland. Now, here's the problem, and this is just always amazing. Um, Lee's plan is uncovered when a Union soldier finds a bundle of cigars, and in it was a secret order from Lee wrapped around them. And this order revealed that Lee had split his forces, that he had sent part of the army under Stonewall Jackson to attack Harper's Ferry, and then Lee was going to move into Pennsylvania. Now, splitting your forces can be a tactical mistake because now you have two smaller armies. Well, McClellan gets this information and goes, "This is my big chance." But he delays for 16 hours, worried over enemy troop strength. This delay allows Lee to find out that his plans have been discovered and reassemble his forces behind Antietam Creek. Now, sometimes this is called Battle of Sharpsburg by Southerners because Sharpsburg is the town nearby. On September 17th, the battle begins. Confederate lines are almost ready to break when Confederate reinforcements under A.P. Hill arrive. So many people are being killed that the creek turns red as so much blood is being spilt in it. There was huge stalks of corn. The corn is all mowed down because of all the gunfire. The battle is a standoff, even though the Confederates are outnumbered 2-1. It's going to be the bloodiest single day of the war with 23,000 casualties. Late in the day, McClellan backs off and allows Lee to escape, and McClellan will not give chase. Lincoln was very angry. He said, "Why didn't you chase him?" And McClellan said, "Well, the horses were tired." And Lincoln sent back a telegram saying, "What have you done that would tire anything?" and then fired him. Now, this is important because on the same day, really, of this Battle of Antietam, the British were seriously considering recognizing the Confederacy and entering on the side of the Confederacy. But with this loss at Antietam, they said, "No, we're not going to do it." Lee had later written that if McClellan had followed him, it could have been the end of the war. McClellan will be sent off to New Jersey for recruiting duty and will harbor a great grudge against Lincoln and will run against him for president in 1864. Well, there's a new Union commander, Ambrose Burnside. Yeah, and some people argue that's where we got the term sideburns. He says, "I will go into attack even in December." Usually armies didn't attack in the winter because it was just too cold, couldn't get food for your animals. So on December 13th, 1862, Burnside moves to attack Fredericksburg. Now, in Fredericksburg, and if you ever go there, I've been there several times, it's pretty cool. The Confederates have the high ground, and they're behind stone walls. Union troops have to cross 1 mile of open field, and Confederates have a clean line of fire, and they can mow down Union troops. Union forces attack 6 times, and each time they're mowed down. I mean, they go, "Let's try it again. Let's try it again. Let's try it again. Let's try it again." And finally, after the 6th time, Burnside, who's in tears, orders a retreat. One reporter at the scene said, "It can hardly be in human nature for men to show more valor or generals to manifest less judgment." And this is another change in the war, is that now that you have rifle bullets, this means that your defenders can fire on attackers almost immediately and from a great distance. They can attack and shoot and kill. It's really a mass conflict. And sometimes when we think about the war, and movies show all these Confederate or these cavalry charges, most of the war was highly impersonal. You shot from a distance, you shot in the smoke. Usually you didn't see each other too closely. But it is quite the slaughter. Well, Lincoln was looking for a reason to issue what he called the Emancipation Proclamation. He issued a preliminary one after the Battle of Antietam, but he issued the official one on January 1st, 1863. The problem was what to do with runaway slaves. They were being considered contraband. You certainly wouldn't return them back to their owners after the war. And Lincoln decided that freeing slaves would make the war a moral cause. And it would also stop Britain and France from ever supporting the Confederacy because they had already abolished slavery. And so the proclamation freed all slaves in rebellious territories. Now, it did not free slaves in those upper South states that were still slave states that were loyal to the Union. And Lincoln was always careful to make sure that they did not offend those, but they will eventually abolish slaves as well. The impact of the Emancipation Proclamation will allow black soldiers to join the Army. And by 1863, black regiments played significant parts in all major battles. Many Union commanders tell Lincoln that the use of colored troops constituted the heaviest blow dealt against the rebels. 200,000 African Americans will serve in the war, 38,000 will die. They will not be treated as prisoners of war. And people like Nathaniel Bedford Forrest, who also founded the Klan, will massacre many of them at the Fort Pillar massacre. So let's take a break from battles and talk about how do you pay for the war. Well, the North did it by having higher tariffs, tax on imports, the first ever income tax. Well, the South started one first, but then the North did one too. And then they printed greenbacks because the paper money, which the back was green. And they also increased the national debt. They also borrowed money from the states. Now, the South, what they did was they issued unbacked paper money, which caused runaway inflation, so much inflation. It was outrageous that usually a wheelbarrow full of money was worth a loaf of bread. Both sides had a draft, the South first. Both sides allowed you to find a substitute for your draft, that if you didn't want to go to war, if you could find somebody else to go to war in your place, you could. And both sides allowed you to pay your way out of the war. You could, in the South, if you gave $500, you didn't have to go to war. In the North, it was $300. And in the South, if you were a planter, you didn't have to go to war anyway. So let's see if we can wrap this up. There's a new Union commander, Joseph Hooker. There's always this mistake out there that the prostitutes that followed these Union armies became known as hooker girls, and that's where we got the name hookers. It's not true. That they find earlier references to hookers back 100 years earlier. But Hooker has 130,000 troops massed. Now, when he has an army that big and he moves into the South, just get this idea, it becomes the second largest city in the South. They are moving so many people. So he decides to attack the Confederates at Chancellorsville. At a critical junction, Hooker is confused by Lee's hit-and-run tactics. Hooker is driven from the field of battle. Lee wins, but it's a costly victory. He's lost 12,000 men, and it's finding harder to replace them. And including these lost men was Stonewall Jackson, who was shot by his own men by mistake. Well, let's move out west at Vicksburg, where things, in the East, it seems that the South is doing so much better. But in the West, the Union is doing fantastic. They're crushing the Confederates. Out west, it's like I said, it's a different story. Grant is trying to figure a way to capture the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg. If he can get Vicksburg, he now controls the entire Mississippi. So he decides to surround the city and starve the Confederates out. Eventually, the Confederates will eat everything they have, including their horses and sometimes even wood, their dogs. They eat everything. They are sieged. They can't get around it. So Lee back east wants to help Vicksburg by creating a distraction in the east. Lee believes that if he can win a major victory on Union soil, it might end the war. And so he's going to head into Pennsylvania. He's trying to do this sneakily. Sneakily is a word, I'm pretty sure. But Union forces under General Meade encounter Confederate troops at Gettysburg on June 30th. Then on July 1st, the battle begins. Confederate troops drive Union troops out of the town, but onto higher ground. It's more secure. Meade calls for more reinforcements. July 2nd, Lee is hampered by the lack of information because his cavalry is missing. He always depended on Jeb Stuart's cavalry. Cavalry at the time was your eyes and ears. They could run places, see where the armies were, and then run back and report, but he can't find him. So Lee orders an attack on the Union's left and right flanks to see if he could outflank them, but both sides are repulsed. On July 3rd, Lee thinks that the Union troops have become demoralized and that if they attack the center, the Union lines will break and they will run away. He's wrong, and it's a fatal mistake. Southern troops must cross 700 yards of open field, and the Union artillery and musket fire devastate them. Of the 14,000 that attack, only 7,000 return. The Confederates have to flee the battle. On the same day that the Confederates flee the battle, Vicksburg falls. At Gettysburg, 51,000 casualties in all. And of course, it's interesting to note that Lincoln comes to give the Gettysburg Address, and at the time wasn't necessarily well received. And for the men of Gettysburg, they had to bury the dead at least 3 times. The first time they buried them. Second time, there were grave robbers who were digging them up. The third time, there was a heavy rain and the bodies floated to the top. So if you ever go to Gettysburg, let me advise you that there's a college there, Gettysburg College, and at the Welcome Center, you can hire one of their professors, and they will drive around in your car with you at the different stops and give you a lecture. I think it's about $65, so it's well worth it if you ever go to Gettysburg. Well, in March 1864, Lincoln puts Grant in charge of all Union armies. It's interesting that Grant, he doesn't expect a lot. He shows up at his hotel in Washington in dusty clothes, and they say, "We'll get you the suite." And he goes, "No, I don't care. Just give me any room. I'll be fine." He's a fairly humble guy. Grant brings a new strategy. He said he's going to move all the Union armies simultaneously. That'll put pressure on the Confederacy everywhere, knowing that they're having problems with manpower. He says, we're always going to attack. We're going to fight a war of attrition. In other words, we have more men than they do. We can outlast them. And they're going to practice a scorched earth policy, depriving the South of any supplies that they can get off the countryside. So Grant pursues Lee, and at the first battle they really hit each other is the Battle of the Wilderness. It's called that because it's fought in the wilderness. Grant has 115,000 men. Lee has 65,000 men. And this occurs May 5th and 6th of 1864. Brush fires erupt. It's hard to see anything. A lot of people die from smoke inhalation or burned to death. Lee loses 31,000 men, and Grant loses 55,000 men. Lee is running out of replacements. Grant, unlike earlier generals, he will keep chasing Lee. He will not go back. Both sides fight again at Cold Harbor, June 1st to June 3rd. The Union is repulsed, but Grant keeps putting the pressure. He surrounds Lee at Petersburg, which begins a 9-month siege. Lee is trapped. He's not going to get out. This is bad news for the Confederacy. He's getting bad news because now he's hearing about General Sherman marching to the sea. Sherman marches toward Atlanta. He's chasing the Confederates under Texas General John Hood. Hood tries to defend Atlanta, but he can't. Sherman captures the city, but he only, we hear about Sherman, and if you watch Gone with the Wind, it makes it sound like he burned the whole city. He didn't. They only burned those things that were of military value. So part of that lost cause myth was that Sherman was very destructive, and historians find that not to be true. Hood tries to distract Sherman to move westward and get away from the Deep South. Sherman will not take that bait, but he will send General George Thomas to keep an eye on Hood. And at the Battle of Franklin, Hood and Thomas forces meet. Confederates have to charge over 2 miles of open field to attack Union forces. They make 6 charges, and each time they're wiped out. One Confederate general had been shot 49 times. Good news is only one of those was fatal. On December 21st, Sherman takes Savannah, Georgia. February 17th, he attacks and captures Charleston, South Carolina, where he sends in African-American troops to occupy the town first. And then on April 9th, Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. May 10th, Jefferson Davis is captured. The cost of the war, I will tell you that when I first started this class long ago, they estimated the cost of the war was 620,000 dead. That number is now up to almost 750,000 dead. with most of those people dying from disease, 2/3 dying of disease, that was typical of the time. The war will also leave at least 50,000 men without a limb. So that's the end of the war. That's a real short, brief discussion of it. What we will do in the next lecture, we will talk about reconstruction of the war and how we put it back together and the problems faced with that. And that's really going to be the last lecture for the course, although the test won't be for a while, but it'll give you time to complete your study guide and do some reading. So I miss all of you, and maybe we'll see each other again soon.